Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like it need Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like it need Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off.
Blast off on another episode of Hero Paranormal Podcast, broadcasting from the base at La Madre Mountain, just south of Area 51. And if you've been paying attention at all, this location in particular has been seeing a lot of UFO activity online. There's been a lot of reports, locals filming it just below La Madre Mountain. One particular local that lives near me is Steve Barone. You can Google some of his videos. My name is Ryan, the original overseer of the airwaves, bringing you an epic episode tonight. When analyzing high strangeness, very few masters of their craft go as far as Barry Fitzgerald. That name may sound familiar. Besides being the lead investigator on the sci-fi paranormal investigative cable show Ghost Hunters International, Fitzgerald can usually be found on covert expeditions around the globe, whether they're filming him or not. I met Barry in the Uinta Basin of Utah, of all places, after he had flown across the Atlantic, and this was all to stay, investigate, and get real about high strangeness there in the Uinta Basin. He stayed at Space Wolf Research for some time, and he is, bottom line, I remain convinced of his abilities. It comes as no surprise. He has had so much to offer over the years. Not only is Barry versed in several languages, including but not limited to French, Latin, German, Romanian, and of course English, please check out what he's got going on and support Barry Fitzgerald at his website, charmstealer.com. Although he is of help, and thanks are definitely due for his efforts on zoharstargate.com as well. We'll get into that. And I hope a whole lot more. This new book of Barry's is, it's amazing. And to read you an excerpt, over the millennia, we have relied on mystics, shamans, and priests to explain what awaits us in the next life. But what if it's all an illusion? What really lurks behind the veil, separating this world from the next? Might this other world be something real and tangible and literally not of this earth? In other words, might what we currently define as extraterrestrials perform an entirely different function? What if the afterlife is an illusion created by the beings that exist within that realm? The deceptions of God and men offers an alternative viewpoint using a hypothesis based on insights gleaned from ancient manuscripts and teachings that our ancestors left behind. You really got to check this book out. The Deception of Gods and Men. It's been way, way too long. Barry Fitzgerald, welcome to the Hero Paranormal Podcast.
Thank you, Ryan. Indeed, it has been too long, and I always welcome the meetup of old friends, and it's great to be able to speak to you again.
Well, we have great reason to speak this time. This is a great opportunity, I should say, and that's your new book, The Deception of Gods and Men. I mean, this is awesome.
Thank you. Yes, it just came out, and it was the official release date was the 1st of March. So things seem to be going okay with that, and while that's gone, and the third edition of the band She is also out at the end of the month. I'm focusing my efforts now on the next book, the Fruit of the Gods, but more on that later.
And let's get to the meat of the matter. This book shines a spotlight on well, these beings that slip through the veil from their world to ours, and how semantics and what people call them or believe they may be may have something to do with what they appear to be. Is that correct, or am I kind of going out on a limb?
The real reason that I really wanted to delve into this particular subject matter was to strip away the mask that seems to be utilized by this particular phenomena. And it was something that I saw, the research, the thread of research seems to weave its way in through many of the fringe research fields. And when we strip away the mask, because many times, and more times than not, when we follow the identity of the mask, we end up at a brick wall. We're not getting anywhere. We're left blinded. We can't find a heritage, a long heritage to the mask. But what we did do is that we ended up following the phenomena in which they interact with us on. And by doing that, I was able to push the boundaries of what we knew about these things back into our history. And I was able to really depend on what our ancestors had also encountered and what experiences they had, and to allow us to try and decipher what this actually was. And that, of course, has led to some very, very interesting hypotheses that these things are not what we initially thought they were.
Well, and this makes sense to me, getting to the fundamentals of the semantics. As you know, there are many congruencies between a lot of these dark adepts, regardless of cultures, and where these entities seem to appear, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's Europe, whether it's North America. There are things that are so wildly similar that they didn't have internet. They had no way of transversing these messages, yet the crystal clear message is a lot of the same candle work as well as other dark magic of those who follow these entities, but the entities themselves take these trickster appearances of whatever seems to be the flavor of the locale in that particular culture.
That's correct. And working with GHI all those years ago, I was able to interact and have direct contact with the likes of the native people in New Zealand, Australia, in South Africa and Peru and places like that. And I was very keen to listen to their folklore and about the beings within the folklore and how they interacted with these things and how those things interacted with them. And it soon became clear when speaking to them that what they were talking about I could clearly take and identify from an Irish standpoint on our little island in the Atlantic Ocean. And I think to myself, but how is this possible? That this is the southern hemisphere. How did our stories get to there, or how did their stories get to here? It was a very curious thing to start to break into and see this commonality between a lot of the phenomena, and that led us down some really deep rabbit holes, and I find that those rabbit holes we needed to be very, very careful with them, and investigate them slowly, and see where it led, because there were many false avenues, and many of those were put in place, I suspect, to try and inhibit our investigation initially, but that soon started to clear, and we really started to nail this down, and especially with the use of our modern technology, it really helped a lot to try and understand this phenomenon, and see that correlation between what we know in the modern age and how that crosses over. And there are many crossovers into that ancestry that I speak about with our ancestors and what they were practicing, and how that correlates with us in a modern age.
Well, and you're absolutely correct. This is such a interesting topic because this is an area where we are kind of going below the narrative a bit, and we are sort of not we, you and Mr. Allen, Brian Allen, have gone below the narrative a bit to reveal the path of the puppet masters whose promises of power and wealth conceal the bones of the innocent. And this is kind of how it's always gone. But yet there are some telltale signs. Isn't that true?
There are, yes. And you know, this is something that was very interesting for us to spot initially, was this initial story that, for instance, it was one side, the story more or less fell into place that it was one side versus another side. And they were of the same coin, so to speak. So these things ended up going to battle with each other. Humanity was caught in the middle. Blah 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 blah. The result of this particular story is that it has migrated through time. And although the characters change, sometimes maybe several times within a generation, the principles of the story remain the same. And this broken record kept being played time and time and time again. And that I have to say that was infuriating for me to see that this is something that we have fallen for continually. And I don't know what it is about humanity, but why we can't suddenly identify this and say, on your bike, we're not going down this route again. But unfortunately, we do.
It's so very true. And not only is it true that there is seemingly a coherent group of individuals that are controlling, creating, and possibly contributing to the narrative, but they're also hiding some key principal features, I think, of that.
They are. And when you start looking at within society about how power comes about, then you tend to find their tentacles not too far away. And to understand that initially that ancient aspect, we have to understand that there were places on this planet where people went to, where the elite, the kings, the priests, where they went to initially make contact with these things beyond. And I say things, and the reason, Ryan, I prefer not to give these a designation is because a lot of them are once we use them today, we've already got those ideas of what they look like and things like that. And I prefer not to give them an identity per se, because those are already preloaded. So I use terms such as they, them, whatever the case may be. But our rulers ended up going to these places where the veils were thin, and they communicated. And by that verse of communicating, they were given wisdom, and knowledge was shared and imbued upon our rulers. Now, when we go back and we look at, we don't have to go that far back and look at the Greek mythology of around, I think it was around 2600 BC. We have these places of oracle where these people came to and they met the oracle, who was the go-between between us and them. And the knowledge was imbued across. Now, there were several types, usually within this contact. One was a type physically that looked like what we would associate as Pan within the Greek folklore, the god of our wilderness. But what I was interested in was the other one, because these were known as the Word. And they were the ones that I really wanted to put the thumb screws on and screw down, because they were the ones that imbued the wisdom to our leaders and our political leaders on how to govern us as a people, how we were to be governed. And these things tended to come at a price. This wisdom tended to come at a price. And of course the payment for following such wisdom, of course, was power, greed, and all the negative connotations, the Achilles heel of the human race. So these negative traits would have been really harnessed from that perspective. Now, it was interesting to see when we cross over these places of oracle, these places where the worlds were thin. When we cross that over into our archaeology, into our technological age, that's whenever we started to see this pattern start to develop. Now, initially, the pattern was pretty typical, and in fact, the ranch next door to yours is very, very similar there, where we see this huge positive magnetic anomaly. And within those positive magnetic anomalies that we identify using the satellite technology, we're able to see that phenomena such as the poltergeist phenomena appears within the paranormal. You've got UFOs that appear, you've got abductions, you've got mutilations, and the list goes on and on and on. That's what we tend to see within these particular areas. Now, those in themselves, although quite bad in their own right, what we fail to recognize in the beginning was the other side of the coin. And that in itself would have been the negative magnetic anomalies. And those really started to come into their own when we ended up going back and delving into the negative magnetic anomalies to see what the connection was there. Because by dabbling into that, we began to see the payment that was possibly asked for by these things from beyond. And the payment was never good.
And as you've mentioned, there's always an exchange. Some of the brightest minds, I'm just, from a research perspective, I've seen some of the brightest minds come to the same belief system. Analysis of research and data has provided them with this exchange that whenever this takes place, we give something of ourselves when we witness these displays. And that's frightening, isn't it?
It really is. And initially, whenever I was looking at the magnetic anomalies, both Steve Mira, a research friend of mine from Zohar, and myself, we ended up in California, and there was an event there that we were attending. We were speaking at. Now, the people outside, they were sitting in circle, and it was after the event was over, and very much like Stephen Greer's work. And they were looking into the sky and seeing these various little lights that were appearing. Many of them, of course, were satellites and things like that. But this is where it starts to get troublesome, because when we now start looking at the way that we are communicating with these things. Now, whenever I say these things, them, they, I'm talking about the true phenomena. I have to make a separation here between man-made technology, man-made drones, man-made craft that are military institutions and weapons specialists are very, very keen at making. We have to make a separation between man-made and the original. Now, for the original, when we're referring to them and they, the way that we brought them forward was to conjure. We brought them into this place, and that in itself is an esoteric practice. Now, call it what you want. It's an esoteric practice, and that has to be identified as that. The moment that we say that we pick up a voice recorder within a haunted house and we switch it on and we say, is there anyone there? We have just gone through an esoteric practice to make contact with them. Now, when you have a bigger group, we tend to see that within the use of a Ouija board. You have more people around it. The intent is greater, but the esoteric practice remains the same. For these things to come through in all their identities, whether it be fairy, whether it be jinn, whether it be grey aliens, they all are coming through on an esoteric level. And that we have to recognize. Because we're not only seeing the greys, for instance, in UFOs or in the bedrooms abducting people, we're also finding them within the seance rooms of old Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So why is a grey appearing in a seance room? Those questions need to be asked, and unfortunately, a lot. It's one of those inconvenient questions that a lot don't like to do. It's much the same as back 10 years ago and 20 years ago. It was always frowned upon when you brought a report forward about a UFO and a Bigfoot at the same time, that were seen at the same time. This was an inconvenient question, an inconvenient data that was more or less thrown to the side. Now we're starting to change. We're starting to accept this and starting to see that, yes, there is some strange type of connection between the paranormal fields, the research fields. But I've completely went off course there. Forgot.
No, you're right. You're right on course, man, because that's my next question was going towards these magnetic anomalies and the particular phenomena that has appeared time and time again in these areas like we were discussing with beings that you've mentioned in your book. They've been historically identified as quote unquote radiating a light or EL. Can we get into that? That's just fascinating for me.
Yeah. The new book that I'm working on, I was going through some of the cuneiform texts and some of the details from there, and there is within the Babylonian texts, there is mention of these gods that shone. And I'm not talking about the Anunnaki or anything like that, because the Anunnaki is something completely different. I'm talking about these beings that appeared, and they were known to wear a garment that exuded this light and awe. And but the strange thing was that for these people who witnessed these shining ones, it was also a scary experience. And I'll get back to that scary experience in a moment, because it's something we need to understand from a biological context about what our bodies are trying to tell us in those moments. But these beings, they not only did they wear this particular garment, they also produced this other element, which, when translated, means it makes your skin crawl.
Oh my gosh.
This was happening in Babylon, for God's sake. 4,000, 5,000 BC. It's the same phenomena, just a different mask. So when we start moving this forward, we start looking into these shining ones and where they're appearing and what they're delivering. And I ended up starting to look at, because of the Medjugorje phenomena, which was happening over in Eastern Europe, where every Tuesday this being would appear and deliver messages. Now that in itself is very irregular. And I was very, 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 very suspicious of this particular type of behavior. And I needed to get to the core of the appearance. And this is where we tend to find valuable information. It's in the initial 10 minutes of this being appearing. Because what was very important is that the children that saw the being were frightened to a point where they stopped. They were frozen to the ground. That speaks volumes. The reason that I say that is because it's our body has a unique ability. Some people will call it, I forget the name now.
Oh, the flight or flight phenomenon.
Fight or flight, yes. That particular fight or flight delivers the information of the nature of what we are witnessing. And that nature can come in many forms, or that appearance can come in many forms. It can be a child, it can be an animal, it can be a person, and they could be smiling at us. But if our fight or flight is kicking in, that is a signal from our part of our soul makeup to tell us, get the hell out of here. But after a period of time has elapsed, they can link into our conscious, that conscious aspect, and shut off the fight or flight. And that can be a very, very damaging aspect. And this fight or flight, getting back to what Steve and I had witnessed in California, we knew that where we needed to be was in one of the strong magnetic anomalies, positive anomalies, which was 7 miles in the high desert from the hotel. Now, we ended up going there. We took 3 carloads to the place, and they brought out their cameras, and they were getting ready. It was like a Japanese tourist spot, and I had to tell them to put the cameras away, because this phenomena is, in its truest sense, does not like the recording equipment or the audio recording or visual recording. And the reason for that, looking at that information from Jacques Vallée and things like that, and cross-referencing, it seems that the camera itself has the ability to capture what is really there. That defies what we're seeing. And when we interview witnesses to the UFO phenomena, you have the witness effect, in which, say there's 3 witnesses or 4 witnesses, 4 of them will see something completely different at the same time. So this in itself really connects back this conscious hook, that once they hook the conscious brain, that's it.
There's quite a quantum entanglement that takes place.
Indeed, yes. But the camera itself will display what is there. So I had to ask the people to put the cameras away. The moment the last camera went, the hair stood on the back of my neck. Now, there was an indication to me that this was not good. But I wanted them to see as well. And I told them they're here. Now, just as that was shared, suddenly this thing appeared over the cars. Boom, 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 boom. This flashing light, it was like a welder's flash over the top of the vehicles. And the communication went on for about 90 seconds and then was gone. And the moment that was over, I told the people to get back into the cars because we're leaving. And there was some objection to that, because, in fact, one of the people I remember saying, but we hear tell of this happening all the time, and now we're here. Why are we going so soon? And I said, because we have to. And when we got back into the cars, they all left. And I, on the drive back, I was saying to her, now, tell me, when you saw this, what did you feel? And she said, it was absolutely amazing to see this, as I said, people have mentioned this before. I've never seen it for myself, and I got to see it. It was amazing. I'm not going to swear, because that's what she was doing a lot of, but she was caught up in the moment. And I said, okay, can I ask, did the hair rise in the back of your neck? Did it rise in your arms and everything else? And she says, yes. I said, that was your fight or flight. It was telling you to leave, because that flashing light was the illusion. Those things were already on the ground. That's why we had to leave. So that was an experience for them. Speaking of other people who for instance, have had encounters with a paranormal nature, say with ghosts. In fact, I just spoke to a guy several days ago, and he was a security officer in this building, and he turned a corner, and there was this person standing in the middle of the night putting coins into a cigarette machine. Now, he says it wasn't the appearance of the guy suddenly there. He said it was the way it made him feel that frightened him half to death. That's the key. The key as to the illusion. The illusion is what you see cannot be depended on. It's how you feel the situation. That is how we must steer this phenomenon. And that steering mechanism within a modern age can be interfered with. Refined sugar can shut down the fight or flight process. And that is a very dangerous situation to be in. We have groups that meet up, for instance, in fast food restaurants before they head off to a location to see what the phenomenon is and what they experience and things like that. By going there and consuming the refined sugar in its various ways, they're actually blinding their own bodies. They don't know what is coming through and what can be depended upon and everything else. And this is something that I reiterate to paranormal investigating groups to make sure that you question what is coming through. Do not accept the first thing that comes along.
Put a filter on it, yeah, because wow.
Put a filter on it, absolutely, absolutely. Because today we live in a society where we have to have everything fast. We have cell phones that connects us to the internet. We have all the information there. We have to have it fast. With this phenomena, we need to slow down. We need to make sure that it is what it says it is. And more times than not, there is a high level of deception involved.
And I kind of want to follow some of these breadcrumbs down the alleyway of mystics, shamans, secret societies. For years, these, even priests, have talked about basically conjuring these lights of sorts. And it seems, with the shamans and the mystics, something, I feel that maybe I've trampled a little bit into this spoiled garden, because something we've began delving into from a research perspective is the use of a quote-unquote God helmet, which is a device, and a fellow researcher began using what's called a quote-unquote Anja lamp. Both of these technologies are supposed to mimic the DMT experience. And back to the shamans and mystics, and in your book as well, it seems that, if it's okay if I read a quick section here. Mm-hmm. During the 1990s, Dr. Rick Strausman, a psychiatric specialist, carried out, let me make sure I got this right, a series of tests on DMT and found that in the right quantities, it produced feelings of euphoria, anxiety, and fear, much of what you're talking about, and in smaller doses, it produced auditory hallucinations. But in higher doses, it produced other phenomena. A large majority of participants in the study began to report a state or feeling that they were able to communicate with other intelligent life forms. Now, during these high-dose sessions, it was reported that the experimenters met with another intelligence, with many describing a superintelligence. Now, this is the frightening part. We're dealing with something that is most likely much more intelligent from a material basis than we are.
There is that, but also with the intelligence comes a level of fear. And whenever I talk about the fear, it's like nothing we can experience on this side. The fear is much more magnified on the other side. For me to stand on one side of the doorway here in Ireland, I can tell you, Ryan, that it was a fear level that I have never ever experienced or want to experience again. Mm-hmm. It was something that was just beyond. And I said to Cormac, my co-author at the time, on Legend Seekers, I said, Cormac, if I ever come across that again, I'm retiring. I don't want to be involved with that again. But that was in itself one of those doorways to them. And now we're starting to understand how these doorways were activated, what was being used, and it's a mixture of from a Neolithic standpoint, is a mixture of sunlight, vibration, and timing. Timing is everything when it comes to this. And so that was very, very important for us to learn. Now, whenever you talk about this phenomena in its changing ways and the esoteric value, I find that we can also lose touch of that esoteric value because we keep bloody well changing the names to the phenomena. Instead of leaving things alone, we reinvent it to make it something new, to make it something real. Wow, this sounds really interesting. But the likes of standing in a circle and wishing that you want to see a craft, a creature, a flashy light in the sky, in itself, when you focus that, you're directing that, I suppose in the modern text, you're directing that to the universe. That thought process is put into your will, and you're sending that to the universe. Now, 10 years ago, there was a book brought out called The Secret, and if not maybe even more, maybe even 20 years ago. And, this big secret that you put your wishes and your intent out to the universe, and you reap what you put out. And again, this is the problem that we have when we start relabeling things, because 2,000 years ago, that particular process by the Druids was known as Grinhalt. It's the same thing, the very, very same thing 2,000 years ago. It was an esoteric practice. Esotericism there's a lot of it within our modern daily lives, and we go about our lives and we're oblivious to it. But there is a huge amount of it there, and it was strange after coming from your ranch, and mulling things over by the time I got back to Ireland, we were just entering into the whole pandemic thing, and then shortly after that we were locked down. But it gave me enough time to look over and think about what I had experienced and seen and felt on the edges of the ranch, and to see that aspect of that ancestral connection to the ranch and what was going on in the ranch. For this idea, for instance, of looking at gold and great wealth that was hidden in the ground or in the mountains. When we look at this particular aspect from and I'm talking about 2,500 years ago, for the Celts that came to this island, we had these great serpentine creatures that guarded the giant, or the huge amounts of silver and gold and everything else. So these creatures, of course, they were responsible for keeping that safe. Now, moving forward and into the Middle Age, the outward appearance of that giant serpent, which in itself was called a pisht, that changed into what we would call today and recognize as a dragon. And of course, when we look at the movies and things like that, you've got the stories there of the underworld and this giant dragon guarding the treasure and everything else, and so you've got all that. But to the ancient Celts, they wouldn't have recognized what we see as a dragon. But let's not get lost in that particular appearance, because isn't it strange that in the ranch next door to yours, who do they have guarding the ranch with a weapon? What's his name?
Dragon.
Dragon. The symbology to it is huge. And when I started to go back and started hunting my way down through the history of that particular area to see the wealth that is still buried in that place, it is absolutely massive. and especially whenever I went back to the 1850s, when the curse of the skinwalker came around. That, of course, came at the same time when we were starting to drop down huge wells for oil. So that tied in with the phenomena starting to make its appearance whenever we started going into the ground. And I saw that as very, very unusual. Yeah, and things, of course, started to get much worse when we moved forward into 1994 to 96. And we see that Utah, of course, was the 15th largest oil and gas producer in the USA. And that was whenever Jim Sherman took over the ranch. So, you know, there's been this connection with the wealth of the land and something that protects it. And the more we start to push, the more they start to push. And you know, it seemed to me it was very, very clear in what was possibly going on there. But anyway, that's neither here or there. Because
I think it's important, though. It is important. The symbology is important. A lot of these small nuances that a lot of people overlook. It might be a ripple effect, much like you mentioned in your book with these things, but there's always a telltale sign, it seems.
There is. There definitely is. And you know, when we look at some of the guys that are responsible or who are involved with the ranch at the minute, you know, when we keep in mind the possible connection to gold, we find that one particular scientist there was connected with XRF, which was an X-ray fluorescence machine, which in itself it was devised to try and detect heavy metals in the ground like gold and silver. So when the people on the show were told that there looks like there's something metal underground, well, I'll leave it at that.
Yes. And it's important also to note, I think it is important to note, that there is, a lot of people think that there's no harm that can be done here, but there is a great deal of harm. And that's why a lot of these properties have security. And as a result, a lot of people are starting to, acknowledge this. But however, it seems like civilization in general, as you mentioned before, the semantics involved, what used to be called the ancient ones is now being called, and I'm guilty of this, ancient artificial intelligence or extraterrestrial ancient artificial intelligence. It's almost as if you just keep rephrasing the same thing. And by doing that, you allow it a longer lifespan. And it reminds me of the very popularized quote, the best trick the devil ever pulled was convincing people he didn't exist. And the semantics involved is exactly that. As long as you don't call it this, it isn't this.
Yeah. Really, to understand this particular phenomena, you have to understand ourselves, our makeup, and that's something that I discuss in the book. This idea that there are three parts of us, which is initially is the soul, the body, and the spirit. Now, at point of death, the spirit leaves; it's gone. Forget trying to make contact with it; it's gone. Mm-hmm. The majority of things that we are making contact with within the paranormal field is the soul. That is the thing that stays longest after death. It can stay for days to weeks, sometimes to months. Mm-hmm. But they can't stay here indefinitely. And where they retract back to is a place which we see within the seance fields and everything else. It is a place of nothing, absolute nothing. There's no feeling, there's no light, there's nothing. And when we open the doorways, trying to make contact, we are opening the doorways to them, and they are coming back. So we are leaving the doors open
They're literally chomping at the bit.
That is causing a serious problem.
And just chomping at the bit for any sort of interaction whatsoever. And it's often been, at least in my research, it's been noted that people, at least the major minds in these attributable fields, say, be aware. Because when you try to open these doors, it's much like anything. The first things that are going to come through are the scorpions, the insects, the bugs, the trash. Yeah, you're not going to, when you roll out this red carpet, you may not get the guest that you had in mind.
That is very, very true. And you know, the idea of opening a doorway to this other place, we may not get anything the first night, but we've left the door open. We don't close. Very rarely do people close the doors now. We leave the door open, but that intrusion may not happen for the next week or the next month or the next several years. And that can cause a real problem. And something really to consider. Again, what we're looking at here is of an esoteric nature. And that in itself, what I was able to see through this and really studying this is that all of the paranormal phenomena, or the psychic phenomena, I should say, is part of us. It is, you know, whenever we hear tell of people who have been abducted by these things coming through, whatever appearance they take, several days or weeks after it, if it was a bad encounter, that they've started developing psychic abilities, and they see them as a gift. Now, what I propose is that this is not a gift. This is our shadow, and I use a double term there, shadow, soul. I see them as the same. It is our shadow stepping forward to make sure that it does not, for most times, end up in the same situation again. Because it's the shadow's responsibility to allow the body to live as long as possible for the spirit to experience. So it's in the shadow's best interest to keep us all working well, and that its ability, which includes remote viewing, and many other things, is all symptoms, or it's all signatures of the shadow. It is all part of us. And a well balanced system of soul, spirit, and body is exceptionally powerful. And in fact, many of these things that come through the veil are afraid of someone who is exceptionally well balanced. And that's noted all the way back, thousands of years. It's known that if you have your balance, you have that. Now, whenever I was writing the influence, which looked at these aspects of the shadow that were coming through, and how they connected to us, and what they were doing to us biologically to allow them to get a better grip to us, that in itself was a huge eye-opener for me, because there was a warning came at the beginning of that book for me. Don't become too bright or they see you. And that particular warning I have stayed true to, because when and I was part of this awareness of an experiment that was conducted in California that went around the world. Repeatedly, the questions were being asked time and time again to these things that were coming through. How do you see us? And time after time after time, on continent after continent after continent, how do you see us? Kept coming back as light. So the warning paid true to me. Don't become too bright or they see you.
Spooky. And this leads us nicely into something that many have encountered. I recently read an article about Aleister Crowley, and and on his deathbed, he said something like, "Oh no, there's something wrong. Like this isn't going the way I expected it to." those entities began entering rooms, and the same is true of other of these dark magicians, snake oil salesmen, etc. And it's interesting that from at least a modern standpoint, that now something that has been denied for years and years and years is almost now mainstream with the recent documentation of the Tic Tac. We have the acceptance of, ATIP and OSAP, these government programs looking into things that are quite out of this world. What does is this just a heads up that the veil is becoming weaker, or how should we take this?
The Tic Tac, I believe, is our technology, and it's run by Air Force. The Air Force won't release the details. The Navy, of course, with it being a black budget, the Navy is not open to that information. You're not going to tell a pilot of a black budget. And it was interesting that there was an article released, it was about 2 years ago, and it spoke about how the U.S. Navy had been retrofitted before they went out to track those very high-speed targets. And it was something that the entire fleet started acting as one unit. And they could see over the horizon and things like that and track these things. So in effect, the Navy was going out already kitted out for this. They just didn't know what they were going to encounter. But as I say, the Air Force won't release that particular data for obvious reasons. Now, the other things, when we start looking at the other phenomena about Crowley, for instance, you just mentioned him there, because there was an interesting aspect that I came across referring to Crowley about 2 years ago. And in Romania, the witches there have this ability to affect someone's shadow through witchcraft. And so that in itself lends some credence to the likes of the old voodoo dolls and things like that. But what was interesting is that well-developed magi can, when they know that they're coming near the end of their life, they can transfer their soul, their shadow, to another. Now, that other tends to be primarily it's more likely to be a boy that unfortunately will succumb to this, and it'll be someone under the age of 10 years of age. And as when this transfer happens, it can be an easy trigger, such as someone to hand over a pencil or a pen, and by that acceptance, the deal is done. And shortly after the magician's death, then what tends to happen is that young person will then have the attachment of the shadow or the soul, and that will start the shadow's intrusion into that harmonic development that initially was very peaceful, and this shadow will start to really imbue its wishes and wants, because that's what shadow is primarily. It deals with our wishes, our wants, our base root instincts, and it also carries the knowledge of what we lived. The information that we gathered during our lifetime is still held by that shadow. When the shadow returns back, if it returns back to where it comes from, the entire unit has an access to all the knowledge. Some people will call it the global consciousness. Others will call it the Akashic records. It's all the same thing. But it was interesting that when this shadow starts to make itself known to the boy, the child will start suffering from symptoms very, very similar to schizophrenia and things like that. Very, very sad. But getting back to Aleister Crowley, before he died, his 10-year-old son came to visit. Shortly after the visit, he started developing, on Aleister Crowley's death, he started developing symptoms of schizophrenia.
How very interesting. And it's interesting that these kids would undergo this, and kids kind of seem to always get the underhanded part of the deal. I wanted to bring up kids that were possibly beaten, threatened, starved, and removed from familiar surroundings. When people ask if the government is aware of this, at least the United States government, there are many cases of this. And one case that is detailed in your book is Camp Hero. Can we go into that for just a quick tidbit before we start wrapping things up?
Yeah, what we tended to find is that within these negative anomalies, we found that that it was up to, I think it was 70 or 75% on the initial search of military installations and weapons development facilities were in negative magnetic anomalies. These were also the places that we tended to find blood worship from our ancestors that occurred. These are also the places, 70%, I believe, of the top 10 suicide locations around the world are in negative magnetic anomalies. These places attract blood worship. And this is something that we were seeing, and this connection that we have with a lot of our military globally, we tend to see this as well. In fact, we see establishments that were closed, in positive magnetic anomalies and opened in negative magnetic anomalies. And that was shocking thing for us to really start to uncover. And this idea of taking the kids and really putting them to the point of death, to allow these things the ability to connect. They broke down the child's resistance and allowed these things the ability to connect much easier. And that, of course, is an absolutely god-awful thing to do, and very, very harrowing for the people involved. Now, it's something before we go that when we look at this idea of our fight or flight being able to be switched off by the use of refined sugar, we have times in the calendar where the doorways between these places become exceptionally thin. And at these particular times, such as Samhain, in the Irish calendar, or Halloween, as you may know it there in the States, we feed our children, who are they are the ones that can detect these things coming through. We feed our children copious amounts of candy. Refined sugar blinds our children.
Coincidence?
Coincidence? Maybe not.
Man, oh man, it's so true. And in conclusion, I think that this book is something everybody needs to have on the shelf, especially when you go into, we've gone into a lot, but you go into so much more, the influence of paranormal abilities and Western held perspectives. The list goes on and on. Can you tell people where they can purchase the book, how they can support you and keep up with your work moving forward?
Sure. They can purchase the book from Flying Disc Press on Amazon, and they can also pop over to my Facebook and catch up with me there directly, or they can nip over to my website at charmstealer.com if they wish to avail themselves of a copy of The Influence and see how the shadow can manipulate us.
So cool. Such a good book. And it's so good to talk to you again. I don't know what the future will hold. Things are so crazy up in the air, but hopefully time will tell. Hopefully we have an investigation somewhere, somehow. But
indeed, Ryan, I look forward to it. I really do.
I really appreciate you coming on and discussing this with our listeners. Thank you, Barry. And I hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Keep safe.
Man, oh man, breaking it down the way nobody else can. Barry Fitzgerald coming to us from across the pond with a lot of in-depth knowledge about these messengers. And, you often hear, don't kill the messenger. Well, we don't know where these messages are coming from. Are these messengers of deception, as Dr. Jacques Vallée has noted? I think Barry Fitzgerald has really tied a lot of dots together in this book. It's a book everybody should really just check out. It's available both on Kindle and regular book form. And you can find it on Amazon or at Flying Disc Press. Definitely check it out. And until next time, keep your eyes to the skies, feet on the ground, but don't forget to take a look around.
Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like it need Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like it need Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off.